Wars helped to break down the feudal order. Terrified of anarchy and sick of it, people turned to new images of stability: the central authority of the crown, the organized state, and a new era of organized violence began. The national monarchies, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
Last time we ended with St. Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic theologian of the 13th century, who argued that all men, Christian and pagan, basked in the light of God's reason and were all part of the same community. But a disciple of Aquinas, a Florentine, known by the name of Dante, was going to take this one step further. For Dante, who was profoundly Catholic, the ideal unity under God was not the church, but humanity. And of this, the Roman Empire was the predestined servant and instrument. In Dante's eyes, the state had a providential mission toward the human race, a mission that was the same in the natural order as the mission of the church was in the spiritual order. This exaltation of the state was almost unique in medieval literature, but it was significant because it looked forward to the Renaissance, to the national monarchies, and to the new humanist culture that would supplant the old order of the Middle Ages. Dante, who lived from 1265 to 1321, was a genius. He was a great poet whose greatest work was a long poem called the Divine Comedy. He was a great dreamer, profoundly affected both by Christian tradition and by the Latin classics. But he was also a typical Florentine bourgeois, deeply involved in local politics and profoundly hostile to the Pope. He spent much of his life as a political exile and as a critic of much that he saw around him. It's sometimes difficult to remember that the rise of the middle class, which Dante in this case represented, the rise of the middle class introduced a factor of great instability in a previously stable society. The activities and claims of the middle classes reverberated at all levels of society, rendering the aristocracy insecure, turning city governments upside down, setting the peasants on the move, even permitting the large-scale wars of the period, especially the 100 Years' War, by finding new ways to finance them. By the 15th century, the old order was in a state of liquidation, and the problem was how to keep society afloat. Every great medieval institution had gone under or was going under. Feudal chivalry was falling before archers and infantry. Feudal castles were falling to gunpowder and artillery. The massive monuments of the feudal age were crumbling. The Holy Roman Empire became a federation of German states with the emperor as its president. The popes exiled to their palace in Avignon functioned as echoes of the French king's will. And then when they returned to Rome, the papacy was torn by factions supporting rival popes. This great schism, as it was called, lasted another 40 years. From 1378 to 1417, as many as 3 popes at one time contended for the support and the contributions of the faithful, and the papacy lost much of its prestige. As industry and commerce grew, they undermined the social system which was based on landholding. The rising middle classes and the rising cities sapped the power of the feudal barons. Rent was being substituted for service, and the serfs were being emancipated so that the land could be sold for money, or so that their manpower could be used in other enterprises. And all of this broke down the old self-sufficient manorial system. Everywhere there was change, everywhere there was disorder, everywhere the old ways were being challenged or replaced by new ones, and this universal welter seemed to carry a menace of anarchy. That was what people were most afraid of. No clear social or moral order, just a struggle for power with no holds barred. A situation in which, as Shakespeare describes it in Troilus and Cressida, there would be no justice and no right or wrong. Force would be right. Then everything includes itself in power, power into will, will into appetite, and appetite a universal wolf, so doubly seconded with will and power, must make perforce a universal prey and last eat up himself. It was because they were afraid of anarchy, and indeed had very good reason to be so. It was because of this that people turned to the central power which presented the very essence of order, the national monarchy. Kings had already reduced the Holy Roman Emperor, who was their nominal lord, to a shadow. Now they turned against the power of their nominal subordinates, the feudal lords. The struggle between the central authority of the crown and the disruptive, decentralized forces of feudalism was going to end at last in the crown's triumph. And the internal unity imposed by the king was then going to prepare the way for external expansion. France was first in the field. Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, was the inspirer and the patron saint of this outburst of French patriotism produced by the misery and the humiliation of the 100 Years' War. The daughter of a well-to-do peasant family, Joan believed she heard voices from angels and God who told her to rally her fellow French and drive out the English. Her martyrdom in 1431 at the hands of an ecclesiastical tribunal in English-controlled Rouen made her an even more powerful symbol of French resistance. By the second half of the 15th century, the war with England was over, feudal divisions were being mastered, and the foundations were laid for a national army and a national system of finance. It was then up to Louis XI in the second half of the 15th century to consolidate the monarchy as the core of a centralized state. After Louis XI and after his successor, Louis XII, the remnants of feudal independence were crushed and France began to expand at the cost of weaker neighbors. Province after province was incorporated into the French monarchy, and before the end of the 15th century, the strength of the new formed nation was going to push across the Alps and into Italy. Meanwhile, other states were following the French example. Ferdinand of Aragon married Isabel of Castile, drove the Moors out of Andalusia, and founded the modern Kingdom of Spain. Before long, Spain would also be pushing outside her borders over the Atlantic into America and over the Mediterranean to challenge the French in Italy. In England, after 1495, Henry VII was going to bring peace and order to the country, while on the other side of Europe, a series of marriages was creating another power. Maximilian of Austria married the heiress of Burgundy in the 15th century and united the Netherlands with Austria. His son, the Archduke Philip, married the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain, and their two sons were Charles V, Emperor of the Spanish Empire, and Ferdinand I, who married the daughter of the King of Hungary and Bohemia and founded the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. A lot of family details that probably bore you, but that set the basis, the structure of European politics for the next few hundred years. And so, as the 15th century turned to the 16th, the political system of Europe was roughly sketched out, although the boundaries of the rival kingdoms were still undetermined, and there remained minor principalities and powers, especially in Germany and Italy, which offered an easy prey to their ambitious neighbors. In Germany, the king was also emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which extended over hundreds of independent principalities and duchies. So he could only attain his office by agreeing not to enforce his authority, and the empire, in effect, was the tomb of German national unity. The unity of Italy, meanwhile, was prohibited not only by the rival ambitions of its cities and princes, but also by the position of the popes. This is Leo X, who became Pope in 1513. Leo and his successors could not tolerate a secular rival in the peninsula, and although the papacy was never strong enough or durable enough to unite Italy itself, it was always influential enough to keep anyone else from doing it, even if that meant calling in outsiders to help. And so Italy, like Germany, was ruled out of the national race and had to wait 300 years for the national consolidation which its rivals achieved by the 16th century. Now, this period was also a time of more contact between states as political and territorial definition grew. And this increased contact, in turn, led to the development of new political forms to handle it. Squatters, isolated on a large plain, have little need for organized communication, but when they stake out their claims right up to their neighbor's property, they see each other more often, they watch each other more closely, they tend to fight. And that's what happened with the national states. Before the era of national expansion, diplomatic relations had been rare and spasmodic, and ambassadors were only dispatched on special occasions. But during the 15th and the 16th centuries, ambassadors became regular and resident. These two French ambassadors were painted in 1533, and while the modern diplomatic system was growing out of the necessity of countries busy watching each other, modern international law was growing out of the need to adjust the increasing number of international disputes. And out of the calculations based on each state's jealousy of the other's growth, the idea of the balance of power grew as well. There were other changes. As the area over which the monarch ruled increased, his authority within his own dominions also increased. This is Louis XII going off to assert his authority, actually not in France, but in Italy. Every extension of the king's sway intensified his dignity and lifted him higher above his subjects. Local liberties and feudal rights which checked a Duke of Brittany or a King of Aragon were much less effective against a King of France, like Francis I, or a King of Spain, who had more soldiers, higher revenues, and better credit. Feudal and local powers fought a long holding action against the crown for hundreds of years, but the tendency was against them once the king became the symbol of national unity and the center of national aspirations. And this monarch gained as much from the growth of the new ideas as he did from the decay of the old. The Renaissance, which we shall discuss in detail next time, the revived study of Roman civil law, eventually the Reformation, all of these would contribute to the growth of royal power. Even scholars who worked with their pens and who had to live on pensions contributed to it. Pensions, after all, can be more easily got from princes than from parliaments, because parliaments don't regard purely intellectual achievements as a service to the state. And so the scholars looked to the king, and the king got his reward in the praise he received from the world of letters. Helped by new benefactors, scholars and artists had the means to study the mythology, literature, and art of the Romans, and from there to rediscover the Romans' political organization and their laws, all of which had a significant effect on European thinking. Just as the classical Latin of ancient Rome seemed superior to medieval Latin, dismissed as dog Latin, so Roman imperial law seemed superior to the barbarousness of European common law and feudal custom. As scholars rediscovered Roman law, its study and application spread outward from the Italian universities, first into the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, whose emperors regarded themselves as the successors of imperial Rome, and then into the rest of Europe. So by the 15th century, the maxims of Roman law were everywhere, and our civil laws are all marked by it. Nothing could have suited the new kings better, because the old common law and feudal custom were based on local interests and constituted checks on any central power. The maxim of the Roman law, however, was that the will of the king was law, and this was a maxim that could be quoted against lords, or popes, or parliaments. There was also the Roman tradition of deifying emperors, and by the 16th century, some European courtiers were almost inclined to pay similar honors to their kings. To understand their attitude, you have to remember the misrule of the previous age, the decline and failure of the previous system, and the strength of popular demand for a firm, masterful hand at the wheel. There is a modern myth that people have always tended towards democracy, constitutions, electoral rights. But in truth, love of freedom has never been the predominant note of popular politics. At most times, popular demand has been for a strong government. The government of the kings was never good, but it seemed better, at least for a while, than the anarchy that preceded it. Authoritarian stability was better than authoritarian anarchy. The violence of an organized state was preferred to the blinder violence of a disorganized feudalism. And in the 14th century, any state that could afford it had means of violence more efficient and more expensive than ever before. Strong government and capital-intensive warfare traditionally go together. That's because the power that controls the weapons can enforce its will. And the first thing it enforces is taxation to pay for more weapons. Taxation, in turn, reinforces the central authority and its bureaucracy and makes it more efficient. So the better the weapons and the military that use them, the greater the central authority's capacity to tax and control, and the stronger its growth at the expense of its subjects and of other lesser powers. The 1300s and the 1400s saw the appearance of weapons that would affect history down to our own day: guns and gunpowder. Centuries before, the Byzantines had used Greek fire, fireballs that helped them beat off the Slavs and the Arabs. These fireballs were shot from catapults, but increasingly from tubes as well. So when the idea of guns with metal tubes reached Europe from India and China in the 13th century, there were European weapon makers who could copy them. Cannon and cannonballs made of iron or stone were useful against walls, ships, and troops in close formation. Turkish French cannon helped drive out the English at the end of the 100 Years' War. And there were also handguns. An English general was killed by a handgun in the last battle of the 100 Years' War in 1452. By the 1500s, the arquebus, the musket, the rifle came into their own and became the core weapon of modern infantry, also the key to European power beyond Europe. It would be handguns that won much of America for Spain and the East Indies for Spaniards, Portuguese, English, and Dutch. In Mexico, the guns of the Spanish were thought to produce lightning. It would be difficult for any man to stand up against controlled lightning. And so the future lay with Europe's more modern armies, equipped with artillery, like the French armies that conquered Italy after the 1490s, and equipped with handguns that won America for the Spaniards, and gave the Spanish infantry a superiority that dominated Europe into the 17th century. After all, not everybody could build a gun. You needed arsenals and expensive equipment. By the 16th century, Spain and other states were spending 2/3 of their revenue on weapons. Naturally, countries with plenty of iron ore and a superior metallurgy had a great advantage, and that meant Central Europe, France, and in due course the Swedes. The new weapons also meant that cities and feudal lords were no longer safe behind their walls. Modern warfare based on guns and gunpowder dispensed once and for all with castles, with knights in armor, and also with a culture of chivalry and the culture of independent cities. It opened the age of the modern state, interested in order, in taxes, and in strong, ever stronger institutions. So war and government and the world in general have all been transformed by gunpowder. Those of you who don't like the idea of a strong interventionist state will deplore this development, and I really see the point. But you have to remember the robber barons and the general disorder that went before. The days of Romeo and Juliet may seem romantic, but they were also days of gang warfare and terror and bloodshed. A lot of English and French and Italians were glad to see noble knights replaced by the king's peace, fragile as it was, and as it still is. Next time, the Renaissance. Until then. Or was it the culmination of the Middle Ages, which had lasted for nearly 1,000 years? Or was it a bit of both? The Renaissance and the Age of Discovery, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
I told you a few programs back that the Middle Ages were invented by the Renaissance. But the Renaissance was invented by itself. I don't mean that people in the 14th or 15th century conjured up the word, but they acted as if they might do so at any time, because they felt so excited by what was going on around them. Now, part of what was going on was the same old mess as before and after: wars, injustice, violence, misery. What we call the Renaissance, after all, ran from about the 14th century through the 16th. So it overlapped the late Middle Ages for more than 100 years. But there was an important difference. There were serious economic problems, but there was more enterprise, more wealth, more leisure in the Renaissance, and also more competition in the conspicuous consumption that went with wealth and leisure. And one form of consumption that especially soared was culture. Culture which adored and pursued antiquity with an extraordinary urgency and passion. Their literature and architecture and visual arts soared, and their achievements made contemporaries feel that they lived in a time when men were at last on the way to recapture the greatness of the ancients. Those ancients against whom the West had measured itself for 1,000 years. If you want to be objective, the West had been reviving since the 12th century at least. The great cathedrals hadn't waited for the 14th century, and previous generations had translated the Greeks, had studied philosophy and the laws of nature, had made technological improvements. In the 13th century, better chimney construction made heating more flexible and thus made privacy possible for the better off. The chimney probably affected the art of love more than the troubadours did, and it fostered more individualism than Renaissance philosophers did. And without another contemporary invention, eyeglasses, we probably would have had fewer philosophers anyway. Among other inventions of the 12th century was the spinning wheel, which not only made yarn cheaper, but also suggested the use of a belt to transmit power. And the wheelbarrow, which cut in half the number of people needed to haul small loads by substituting a wheel for the front man. And even the button, which revolutionized the history of clothing. So the Middle Ages was often innovative and increasingly productive. But what changed most in the 14th century was the mood, perhaps because what was being done was less to the glory of God and more to the glory of man. You can see this in literature, where the rebirth of ancient Latin and ancient Greek revived the Greek belief in man as the measure of all things and introduced subversive notions of a life unencumbered by revealed religion. It's characteristic that this secularizing spirit was represented by men and sometimes by women who called themselves humanists because they were interested in human nature and human values. To put it differently, they were trying to discover the secret of the good life, the virtuous life. And they thought they could find it not in the centuries just past, where no model seemed to fit their bill, but by looking back at antiquity. If you read Seneca or Cicero, and if you wrote like them, then you could hope to become as good, as great as they had been. So the humanists revived the classics, and they studied and they taught them in the humanities, which were supposed to teach you to be good, that is, virtuous and honorable in private and especially in public. The humanities stressed personal judgment, the worth and possibilities of individuals, man's free will, his superiority over unformed, unpolished nature, his duty to society. And they are at the origins of the classical curriculum, which was going to last into the 20th century. The typical Renaissance humanist was a professional scholar. Today, he would be a professor. Like many professors, a lot of humanists were chiefly interested in splitting hairs or coming out with learned quotes. But also, like some professors, humanists wanted to prepare their students and readers to operate wisely in the world. Ideally, most of these students would be princes or courtiers or men and women who exercise some power around them. Certainly they would have to be educated because they had to know Latin. One of the most famous humanists of the Renaissance was a Dutch monk, Desiderius Erasmus, who lived from 1466 to 1536. When he wasn't editing texts, Erasmus dedicated himself to teaching morals and culture, good manners, common sense, civility, and the Christian virtues, all of which were as signally lacking in his day as they are today. But I prefer one of his Italian contemporaries, Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli was a less erudite man, but more inclined to think for himself, and what this produced, you can see if you read his little book, The Prince. Machiavelli has been much condemned as cynical and immoral because his book describes power politics as they are and not as they should be. But Machiavelli had a lot of experience with politics in one of the most politicized cities of the time, Florence. This is the court of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who ruled the city when Machiavelli was growing up there. In the mess that followed Lorenzo's death, Machiavelli learned to consider politics as a jungle where the strong take what they can, the weak go to the wall, and ordinary people fare better under strong rulers than under weak ones. In a way, Machiavelli simply described what he saw around him. More important, though, he separated metaphysics from politics. Religion or morality or law became just another factor of political action, like armies, like taxes. And this was a radical break from medieval tradition. But apart from Machiavelli, and perhaps I should add Thomas More, most humanists have little to say to us today. Their writings are not very readable, they're overstuffed with classical references and quotes. It's much more exciting and much more accessible to trace the new spirit of the Renaissance in the visual arts, which really illustrate the vigor and the excitement of the time and its focus on human possibilities. You can begin to see the change by contrasting the great mosaics of the 11th and 12th centuries with the work of Giotto, who lived during the late 13th and early 14th centuries in Florence in the early days of the Renaissance. Many of Giotto's contemporaries still created great, majestic, hypnotic figures of authority and power, or else they painted puppet shows in the impersonal Byzantine manner, full of lifeless mannequins in splendid attire. But Giotto's work was affected by the new revival of classical ideals, and especially by the new humanity that St. Francis had brought to religion. Giotto's approach was emotional and urgent. Unlike the stiff manner of the Middle Ages, it expressed a new humanity. So Giotto was innovative, but he was also profoundly Christian and medieval. Characteristically, his best-known paintings can be seen in a chapel in Padua called the Scrovegni Chapel because it was built by the son of a usurer of that name. Old Mr. Scrovegni was so notorious that Dante placed him in one of the circles of hell in the Inferno. So here you have a typical medieval act of redemption. The usurer's son holds out his chapel in a propitiatory gesture to make up for the ill-gotten family wealth. Now compare this with a picture painted in 1434, 100 years after Giotto's death, Jan van Eyck's portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife. We are in Bruges, but the subject is an Italian merchant and his young bride. We are in the house of a businessman and a moneylender like Scrovegni, but the couple is presented as if they were nobles, and they make no apologies for their money. And look at the realism and the precision of presentation, which are in keeping with the rationality of a new, more secular society. 50 years go by, and Botticelli is painting his Birth of Venus in Florence around 1485. By this time, spiritual concerns have been drained out. Not from all life, of course, far from it, but from this painting. All Botticelli seems to care about is sensuousness and recreating the ancients. He takes an ancient subject, he tries to paint it as the ancients would have done, and he revels not in spiritual, but in sensuous beauty. Then another 50 years go by, and Michelangelo paints the Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, finishing in 1541. It's an overwhelming composition, and the best thing really is just to look at it and gasp. I mention it here because it's so different from any kind of medieval Christian spirit of hierarchy or order. And in the same room, there are also frescoes that Michelangelo painted a quarter century earlier. These are about the creation. And they look to me like a powerful, explosive affirmation of man. So in these two works, the Renaissance has really supplanted the Middle Ages. When he painted The Last Judgment, Michelangelo was an old man in his 60s. Rome had been sacked and pillaged a few years before, and the old sense of unlimited possibilities had started to crack. But the thing that strikes me is that whether in a vision of torment, doubt, defeat, or in a vision of affirmation, you can find here in a Vatican chapel, at the center of Western Christendom, you can find here one of the ongoing themes of the modern Western world. Man is great. He's always in trouble, but he's the most impressive thing we've got. And this is a theme you wouldn't have found 400 years before. This greatness of man was going to be proved and accelerated in another way by the invention of printing from movable type, which occurred in Germany around 1445 and which we attribute to a goldsmith called Gutenberg. By 1480, over 110 European towns had printing shops. And by 1500, about 20 million books had been printed. And the 16th century was going to see at least 10 times more than that. The humanists quickly realized the advantage of cheaper and more numerous books. So did the church. At first, most of the books were for clerks and clerics anyway, and most of them were in Latin, which meant that access to reading was limited. But by the 16th century, this changed. Magistrates, burghers, tradesmen owned books, often in their own language. A publishing industry grew up to cater to more simple people with pious books and entertaining books and almanacs. And chivalric romances of adventure and glory were turned out in vast numbers by Italian and Spanish printers who fed the dreams of future conquistadores. And in fact, during the 15th century and the first half of the 16th, the Renaissance, a period of intense and passionate cultural achievement, was going to coexist with the age of discovery, a period of fervent expansion. Just as there had never been so much variety and creativity in the arts, so too had there never been so much exploration and discovery. When Bartholomew Diaz rounds the Cape of Good Hope in 1487, Botticelli is helping to paint the Sistine Chapel in Rome. In 1506, Columbus dies impoverished, forgotten, still believing he discovered the coast of Asia. And the same year, Bramante begins to build St. Peter's in Rome. In 1513, Balboa crosses the Isthmus of Panama to reveal the existence of the Pacific, and Machiavelli publishes The Prince. Raphael dies in 1520 when Magellan is sailing around the world and a rebellion is gathering in Germany around a monk named Martin Luther, a rebellion which would soon burst into the Reformation. And in the 1530s, while Pizarro is conquering Peru, Erasmus and Rabelais are in full bloom, while Michelangelo is painting his Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. The Renaissance and the Age of Discovery were two peaks of achievement, one of imagination, the other of action. But did they have anything in common? Is it possible to say that Erasmus wrote and Raphael painted and Bartholomew Diaz ventured past the Cape of Storms in obedience to a similar impulse? And was this impulse derived from some common experience, a way of thinking, an approach to living that historians have agreed to call the European Renaissance? Did the urge to discover new lands grow from the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance? And what effect did the broadening of geographical horizons have on the mental horizons of the people at home? The first thing we can say is that human nature did not change, but the scope of human aspirations was increased by greater material possibilities. By the 1480s and 90s, Europe had developed an agricultural base, an industrial capacity, a superiority in arms, and a skill in sailing the oceans that enabled it to explore the rest of the globe, to conquer and loot and colonize it for the next 4 centuries in a way that the greediest ancient Roman would have envied. Many of the material things that made this exploration possible, however, came out of the Middle Ages. The magnetic compass was adopted by 1187. Sea charts and pilot books were available after 1280. And the ships and the guns that explorers used were not developed by Renaissance intellectuals, but by craftsmen. And just as the means of exploration developed out of the Middle Ages, so did the motives behind it. This is the reception of Columbus by Ferdinand and Isabella. They and other rulers were interested in gold and silver to supplement dwindling sources at home, and in slaves, and in spices from the East, which were necessary in the first place to preserve food, which spoiled fast in the ages before refrigeration, and then quite simply to make lousy food eatable, tough and stringy meat from skinny cattle, tasteless vegetables, unappetizing and often spoiled food in general. But this spice trade was threatened by the advance of a new Muslim power, the Turks, who took Constantinople in 1453, and the Balkans as well, thus upsetting the commercial balance of the Mediterranean. Before that, Italy had enjoyed a near monopoly of the spice trade for several centuries, which was the source of much of its prosperity. So the countries of Western Europe sought to outflank the Turks and the Italians as well. France, Spain, Portugal, England, and the Netherlands all saw the possibilities of sailing south or sailing west to reach the East Indies, and they had the means to do it. Another motive, universally expressed and quite widely believed, was the desire to extend Christianity. And here too, the age of discovery did not see something new, but the redirection of an earlier medieval motive, which had linked conquest and gain with missionary enthusiasm in the Crusades which Europe had sent out since the 11th century. This crusading ideal had declined precipitously, but it was revived by the advance of the Turks in the southern and eastern Mediterranean and by the fall of Constantinople. And it was maintained by the war against the Moors in Spain, which only ended significantly in 1492, at which point the Spanish crown finally gave Columbus permission to sail. The most Renaissance aspect of discovery lay in the cooperation between the crown, geographical experts, and highly educated merchants out for profit, but also very curious and increasingly well-informed. And we can find aspects of a new mentality among seamen and travelers as well. We find it in a Venetian called Cadamosto, who said that he joined the Portuguese sailing down the African coast in 1455 and 1456 in order to see interesting sights. And we find it in another Italian, Antonio Pigafetta, who joined Magellan's expedition 60 years later to experiment, he said, and go and see with my own eyes a part of those things we have heard so much about. And finally, we find it in the great explorers themselves, who were not just leaders and seamen, but who had to visualize their undertaking within the context of an emerging knowledge of the world as a whole, testing the hypotheses of medieval geography and developing them into a new science altogether, as we shall see in our next program.
Funding for this program was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
For information about the Western Tradition television course, transcripts, pre-recorded video cassettes, off-air taping, or related books based on the television series, viewers should call the Annenberg CPB Projects 1-800-LEARNER telephone number, or write to the Annenberg CPB Project, 1111 16th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.
This is PBS.
Hi, I'm Kenny Rogers. You know, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas, as the song says. And if you're ready to get into that holiday spirit, here's a suggestion. We're putting on a special concert for all of you who watch public television.
You got to know when to through the year. Know when to fall to find time to leave me loose. Know when to walk away. Know when to run.
You could have heard a pin drop when Tommy stopped and locked the door.
We can build a snowman. We'll pretend that he is Parson Brown.
I'll be performing many of my hits as well as Christmas favorites we all love to sing. My special guest will be the Forrester Sisters. So come on along and we'll save you a seat front row center.
Saturday, December 2nd at 8:35 on Channel 47.
Next on Nova. Can science explain music? How do you make a musical sound? What makes a fine old instrument? Or a completely new one? How does music affect the mind?
It's like saying, wow.
What is music? That's next time on Nova.
Tuesday at 7 following McNeil Lehrer on Channel 47.
Some of these trees are more than 300 years old, but today this ancient forest is home to Mek birds, Mek squirrels, Mek wildcats, Mek deer. And you probably don't need to see their tartans to know that we're in Scotland, which is where you'll find the Great Wood of Caledon. So take a trip with us to the Scottish Highlands next time on Nature.
Sunday at 7 on television worth watching, Channel 47. Public television from an all-America city. You're watching Channel 47, WTVP, Peoria.
Funding for this program was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
The discovery of new societies confronted Europeans with a dazzling range of beliefs and institutions different from their own. It persuaded some that the world was their oyster, and it led others to begin a revolution in critical thinking. The Renaissance and the New World, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
Last time we ended with a confluence of two great movements, the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries. And yet we also saw how many of the material things that made exploration possible came out of the Middle Ages, as did many of the motivations of European governments. Primarily the quest for spices and slaves and converts to Christianity. But what about the explorers themselves? Do they reflect a new Renaissance mentality that we define as modern? Or was their vision primarily a medieval one? What kind of men were they? What motivated them? As evidence, we have Richard Chancellor's statement that he was describing his search for a northeast passage in 1553 so that, as he says, he may encourage others to the like travel. Now, this is a very modern kind of self-awareness and an equally modern sense of being part of an evolution, not a one-shot adventure like Marco Polo's trip to China in the 13th century, but an ongoing process. And both are very close to the intellectual temper of the Renaissance. And there is another Renaissance trait which the explorers possessed, and that is their appetite for fame. The passion for glory provides a major theme of Renaissance art, especially with the presentation of distinguished contemporaries as memorable characters from antiquity. This is Gianfrancesco Gonza, an Italian captain general depicted as Mars, the god of war, while his wife Isabella is Venus. Some explorers like Columbus were also fired by missionary zeal. But fame, the desire to be known for having accomplished great deeds, this was a strong component in the explorer's motivation. And that became especially true as more and more travel writing came on the market, as printing spread and began to compete with romances of chivalry. So here you have the search for fame, the search for fortune, but within a context of exactness and full proof. And in a world where it seemed that very few things were still left undone. And if they were undone, that was a good reason for getting them done. And this is very much a Renaissance attitude. But we're on even firmer ground when we turn, oddly enough, to theory. Theory was the fuel of action in the Renaissance as it had not been in the Middle Ages. The revival of antiquity, the rediscovery of theories which appeared to have influenced action in the past, produced new concepts and models for action that would change the world. The humanists, or at least their pupils, really did try to be the all-round men that Cicero praised. The architects and artists were actually affected by theoretical treatises based on assumptions about what had produced great art in ancient times. And the soldiers, who now had longer pauses between crises, adopted all sorts of military ideas from the ancients about how to organize their troops, or fortify, or besiege a city. And it might have had the same effect on geography if it hadn't been for the actual voyages which forced Renaissance scholars to reconsider their theories about the size and shape of the world in the light of actual experience. Not all of the classical theories agreed either. Ptolemy, a 2nd century Greek, was one established authority who believed that you couldn't sail around the world because Africa merged with a large continent that filled the southern hemisphere and joined Africa to India. On the other hand, there was the geographer Strabo, a contemporary of Augustus, who thought that the ocean sea to the west washed the southern shores of Asia. You had to be careful when you sailed the ocean because you might fall over the edge. Still, Strabo believed, to quote him, that the uninhabited world forms a complete circle, itself meeting itself, so that if the immensity of the Atlantic did not prevent it, we could sail from Iberia to India along one and the same parallel. By the early 1400s, Strabo's theories were gaining ground as sea charts and ship logs got better. There was also constant contact between the sailors, the theorists, and the map makers. The best example of this could be found at Sagres, at the southwest tip of Portugal, where in the middle 1430s, the Portuguese prince Henry the Navigator, a remarkable figure, founded a small court to which he attracted seamen, cartographers, astronomers, shipbuilders, and instrument makers, and from which, with improved ships and maps and instruments, he sent out expeditions that went further and further down the African coast, practically to the Ivory Coast. Henry's ultimate purpose, and he wasn't alone in this, was to outflank the power of Islam and to establish direct commercial contact with a source of gold and slaves, ivory and spices in Africa and in Asia. So Henry's brother went to Florence to buy maps, and Columbus elicited an important letter from another Florentine geographer, Toscanelli, that assured him that he could get to China by sailing west. And when the sailors made their discoveries, they were quickly recorded in the maps the cartographers drew up and revised for other sailors to use. This map belonged to Columbus. In essence, this process of exploration was the first demonstration of the scientific method, proceeding from hypothesis to experiment and then on to a new hypothesis. And it was demonstrated for all interested men to see in the largest and the most dramatic way. The hypothesis that there was open water between Europe and Asia to the west, as Columbus first believed, was disproved not by abstract calculation, but concretely by revealing an enormous new territory full of exotic peoples and providing a new way of life for thousands of soldiers and settlers. And it was a continuous process with the findings and ideas of one man entered on maps until further experimental voyages disproved them or revised them. What you have to remember is that the scientific method, which we take as the hallmark of modern thinking, could not be applied rigorously in a pure scientific field, in astronomy or physics or chemistry, until the 17th century, when the pendulum clock and the telescope and the microscope were developed. Before that, however hard the would-be scientist thought, it was difficult to verify his ideas because the means for scientific proof were rudimentary. One field where you could actually verify theory was the field of discovery through the cooperation between the theorizers at home and the observers in their ships. You might even say that the first scientific laboratory was the world itself. So the age of discovery and the Renaissance were in partnership. But it was a fumbling and confused relationship because the first explorers carried with them a mass of medieval presuppositions which prevented them from making a properly objective report on what they saw. What the public wanted and got a lot of were monsters and marvels, and giants and dwarfs and headless men with faces in their chests, and dog-headed men, and men with one huge foot which they could use as a sunshade, and all kinds of other grotesques. Another feature in the new lands that people wanted to find or to hear about was the existence of an earthly paradise, some golden age existence where men could be found happy, naked, free, without government or property, without disease or melancholy. One major reason why Europeans wanted to believe in the existence of paradise was that they fared so badly at home, where they were torn by war, eaten by plague, brutalized by poverty and famine, and all kinds of other troubles. So explorers were tempted to color their facts to fit their hopes, and publicists popularized and vulgarized their reports to turn the Indian into a noble savage and life in the New World into a kind of moral symbol of the Golden Age. But these fantasies were going to collide with something else, something very urgent and very concrete, which was the religious issue. Significantly, the first question European intellectuals asked about the natives of the New World was not what are they like, but can they be saved? And that was because the societies being discovered in the New World did not fit into the framework of the book of Genesis. So it wasn't clear whether Jesus died for these creatures and whether they were really human at all. The question was important because the sort of treatment the Indian might expect depended on the answer. The view that the Indian was an animal, hence a natural slave, this view was pressed with some force. 16th century Englishmen, for instance, assumed that the Indians were on the whole wild, ignorant, and animal-like. For their part, the Indians quite sensibly refused to work the hours, wear the clothes, follow the diet of Europeans. So the way was open for the pessimists to point out that Indians were incapable of living virtuously and freely, and that they must therefore be by nature slaves. This notion fitted very well with a growing clamor for cheap labor to work in silver mines like this one in Peru or on sugar estates in a climate which sapped the energy of white men and which would soon take the lives of the natives. Even worse would be the devastating European diseases for which Indians had no immunities. With European brutality confirmed by economic need, with forcible conversion to Christianity accepted as common necessity, the slave trade took on a new and long-enduring lease of life, or rather death. While in this painting, a European artist depicts Indians worshipping a column erected by the French explorer Laudonnière. So here we find several further ingredients of the modern world. A new treasury of myth and of incentives on one hand, and on the other, the role of the European as exploiter and colonist, rationalizing his activities by drawing on those very myths to justify his doings. And yet the counter-agents were at work within the experience itself. Above all, the novel tendency to compare and contrast, which arose out of the variety of new information and experience pouring in on Europeans during the Renaissance. Where medieval people reasoned by association, learning about one thing by connecting it with something similar, modern reasoning involves contrast as well as association. This is different from that. What do I learn from the comparison? And this kind of thinking entered our intellectual habits, not only when the humanists of the Renaissance revived the civilization of pre-Christian antiquity and compared it with their own, but also when newly discovered societies all over the world confronted Europeans with a wide range of governments and religions and social habits that were different from their own. But before the sophisticated races of the East or the more primitive races of the West could present thought-provoking contrasts, they had to be seen not merely as picturesque, but as the product of a specific environment. You had to go beyond the striking detail, the nakedness, the war paint. You had to go on to a more anthropological approach. And you begin to find this when one of Vasco da Gama's officers spends the night with the natives of the Cape of Good Hope to see how they live and what they eat. Or when missionaries begin to learn the languages and the religious beliefs of the peoples they were trying to convert, because they could only hope to convince the natives when they had entered into their world and values. And by the 16th century, the greatest mind of the 16th century, I mean Michel de Montaigne, is fascinated by cannibals, by so-called savages who seem far less savage and far closer to happiness and virtue than his own fellow citizens. Not just far less savage, more sensible too. Cannibals kill, but they kill for a purpose. They want to eat. We, says Montaigne, we kill to no good purpose. And so here, 400 years ago, we can hear the forest murmurs of relativism. But it was very far away, and it was going to be a very slow process that culminated in the 18th century when the comparative study of strange societies and religions and brave new worlds would lead to a critical re-evaluation of European religion, philosophy, and political structures. But that had its roots, I think, in the Renaissance, in the growing willingness based on a growing necessity to see, estimate, evaluate, test, to learn more and actually use it. Invest it, so to speak, in order to learn more still, to seek not only knowledge, but precise knowledge, to examine not only the self subjectively, which was one of the great joys of Renaissance humanists, but the world objectively, because objectivity was the great liberator, the widener of mental horizons, the progenitor of modern science. It was fed by forcing the imagination not inward, but outward, exposing it to challenging information about different ways of life. It was the humanists like Erasmus who laid the ground for this critical and comparative approach to information and experience. And when Erasmus and the other humanists said that one authority was superior to another, that a Roman author was a better source of wisdom than a doctor of the medieval church, they implied the right to decide between different authorities and therefore the possibility to judge for yourself. And the best of them, like Leonardo da Vinci, decided to place experience and experiment above any book, above any second-hand authority, and this was something new. Leonardo was not only a great painter of subtlety and understated harmony, he was also a great architect and engineer. His great love was scientific observation, especially anatomy. He was fascinated by the forces that move nature. This sketch is from his study of hydrology, the properties of water. And he approached these forces in a thoroughly empirical way. When he works out his geological theories, he doesn't look for a text in Aristotle, he looks around him. He notes that things that are born in salt water are found on high mountains far from present seas. And he concludes the phenomena we witness explain the past. He dissects bodies. He suggests the possibilities of comparative anatomy. He predicts the helicopter. And when he dies in France in 1519, his title is first painter, architect, and mechanic of the king. Soon after Leonardo's death, a French physician, Ambroise Paré, provided the formula of the new scientific approach when he wrote that we have to use the ancients as stilts or towers from which we can see further than they did. But, said Paré, whenever experiment contradicted the ancients, we must follow what we see. Tradition is no use if it just encourages you to go on making other people's mistakes because you're too lazy or too timid to strike out for yourself. I would prefer to do everything by myself than to fall into error with the sages and even with all mankind. Knowledge, says Paré, is a great thing, but only if it is based on experience. This new attitude was going to lead men to examine things for themselves. Natural phenomena, political institutions, even the Bible. Until the Renaissance, all these had been accepted simply because they were there. Now they could be considered in terms of appropriateness, effectiveness, and opportunity. Obviously, this didn't all happen at once. Most people conformed as they had always done without much question. But the fact remains that by the 1600s, knowledge and science had ceased to rest on an inert tradition transmitted from the past. They became the knowledge, science, investigation of what is, which you acquire by searching and looking and drawing conclusions from what you see. And this is a revolution. Or at least it's the beginning of a revolution, as we shall see in the program.
Continue to divide.